tail where the lightning had struck, and there was a tail sticking out from an insulator where we could easily sleeve it together, and that's all we'd have to do, put an automatic sleeve in the thing, and we would be done. So Gary set his truck up there at that pole and started up. We had hooked a strap horse to the down wire that was on the ground with, of course, a grip. And so Gary started up with that, and it became obvious to both of us almost immediately that he was not going to be able to reach up there to put the hoist onto the conductor at the insulator. So I also had about the same size bucket truck, so I immediately opened up the door on where my climbing tools were, and I started putting my hooks and belt and all that stuff on. And Gary dropped to the ground and decided that we would both go up in his bucket. Now, both of us was pretty good-sized fellas back then. So got up in the bucket and started up, and the truck was slow, and I said, just drop this thing back down. I said, and I'll go up by myself, and I'll step out onto the pole, and we'll work from there. You can lower the bucket back down with the lower controls, and so that's what we did. I got up where I could step out onto the pole and climbed on up to where the conductor had been cut by the lightning and safed it off. Gary followed me up, and we took the strap hoist and got it on the conductor and pulled it up to sag and sleeved that conductor back together, and we were through with the job. And I happened to look on the other side of the pole, and there was a cracked insulator on the other side of the pole there. Now, this was three-phase coming from the substation on the 202 feeder. And there was a two-phase pull-off on the back side of the pole right there, and there was a set of solid blade disconnects there that were open. Now, we had talked about what the way we were going to work it, and I assumed that when Gary had got there that he had gone ahead and opened those disconnects. Now, then I didn't talk to the dispatcher. Gary was the one that had talked to the dispatcher. This is just the way this thing played out. And so when I got up there, my rubber gloves, I had left them inside the bin on the truck, and I didn't have a pair of rubber gloves. I had a pair of climbing gloves on and so forth. So I got up there and sleeved that together and looked over there, and there was that broken insulator. I reached out. Gary said, I've got an insulator here in my ditty bag on the side of the bucket truck. He reached and got the insulator out, and I swung around a little bit and reached out there to untie that insulator, and when I touched that tie wire on the insulator, that's when it happened. Immediately, instantaneously, of course, 7,200 volts entered my right hand, and I remember thinking just for a split second, boy, you have messed up this time. You try to let go, and you can't, because that current is overriding those electrical impulses that your brain sends to your muscles, your body, to make your body work. And that 7,200 volts interrupted that flow, and I could not let go of it. And that's the last thing that I remembered at that point. Gary did exactly what he needed to have done. He dropped his bucket to the ground and ran to the radio and called the dispatcher and told them that we had a man on the pole who was on fire. And I literally was. It had ignited my clothes. They were burning. And I was laying back in my belt, safety belt, body belt at this time, in an almost horizontal position. My clothes was on fire. And Gary came back up to where I was at, and he put the fire out where my clothes were burning. And he was able, because he had cut some secondaries and neutral and stuff down, he was able to get it in a better position than he was originally, so he could reach up and get a hold of me. Now, here I was hanging there lifeless, and he looked at me, and I was not breathing. My pupils would not dilate or react to the light. So he did the best thing that he knew how to do, and he was going to give me mouth to mouth to start with. He had already, and I was told this later, he had hit me in the chest a couple of hard blows with his fist. And then he was going to blow 2 breaths of life into my mouth, but he could not give me mouth to mouth because my jaw had set from the pain I had experienced. My jaw was locked. So he did the next best thing, and that was he blew into my nose. He blew air into my nose, and he beat on my chest, and that went on for matter of seconds, minutes, whatever. And finally, I heard him screaming at me and hollering at me. He was telling me, he said, Johnny, don't do this to me. You're going to have to help me. Come on, Johnny, help me here now. Come on. And I immediately, as I was regaining consciousness, I told him, I said, boy, this is one bad dream I'm having. And he replied, Johnny, this is not a dream. You're going to have to help me. You've burnt your hand, and you have to have your help. So he took the strap hoist that I had used and sleeved that wire together, and he took the loose end and threw it up to the braces on the cross arm above us there, and hooked the other end of the strap hoist into the D-ring on my body belt. I was a pretty good sized guy at that point in time, but he could not move me forward enough to unbuckle my safety strap around the pole, a leather safety strap. A crowd of people had gathered around there at that point in time, and he looked to the ground and hollered out, has anybody got a knife? He had forgotten his knife, and he couldn't get to my knife. I had a practically brand new knife in my pocket, but he couldn't get it because of my body belt. So there just happened to be a guy there that stopped that day who just happened to trade in knives, who just happened to be an old softball player in the industrial league, and he said, I've got one right here. He had bought a brand new buck knife that day and had sharpened it on the job, and he took it out of his pocket and he pitched it up to Gary, and Gary caught it the first time. Just happened that way. So Gary opened the knife up and he cut the strap going around the pole. Still had me with the hoist, and he lowered me to the side of the bucket truck there and started down. On the way down, he hollered out. And there was, like I said, there were people there. Actually, there were some relatives of mine that were there, and he didn't know who they were or whatever. But I had a niece, my wife's niece, whose husband was an EMT, and he'd heard the call go out. He was at home, and he drove out the highway there, and the rescue squad from the town of Walden, the Walden Ridge Rescue Squad, they had by that time arrived on the scene as well, and they helped get me out of the bucket and lowered me to the ground and drove me about less than a quarter of a mile up the road to where the waiting life force ambulance had arrived. Our dispatcher had contacted life force. We had a direct line to the life force helicopter at that time. And they had immediately called them and dispatched them, told them what had happened, and they immediately had taken off and had landed up there to where the accident had occurred. And they loaded me into the Life Force helicopter and flew me to the burn unit at Erlanger. We had a burn unit at the hospital there, and it was such a godsend because when I got there, they immediately took me downstairs. They'd already been assessing me. They'd already been giving me, stuff that, the pain that I was experiencing was still horrific because it had burnt my hand. It looked like a piece of coal. And so they took me down into the burn unit and put me in a deep breathing tank. And I can remember vividly the pain and the anguish that I was experiencing. And they immediately started cutting my clothes off. And one of the girls that was there working on me, she said, now, Mr. Day, you're going to have to just forget about being modest. Said, we've got to do this to evaluate you. So they cut every stitch of clothes that I had on off and immediately started working on me, of course, And so that was the beginning of my stay at the burn unit. I stayed at the burn unit for almost a month. They would come in from time to time and check on me. When I arrived at the hospital, I had blood in my urine. Of course, it was obvious, that the path had crossed my body. It had entered my right hand and exited my left leg. So I had burns on my left leg where the current had flown out of my leg into my calf and into the pole and dissipated. There was not another mark on me until you got down to my buttocks, which were also burnt. Across my buttock, major burns. And so this began a series of regiment treating that went on for days and days. The Sunday after my accident, they had been trying to save as much of my hand as they could, but it became evident that they were going to have to remove it because they were afraid that gangrene would set in, and it would make, they would have to cut my arm off if they didn't go ahead and cut my hand and part of my arm and all off there. So the Sunday, they had to remove my hand. And so I can remember vividly when it was about time for them to come and get me, of course, my wife had to sign the papers to have my hand removed. And it was anguish for her, of course, to have to do that, but there was no other choice. So anyhow, then after they removed my hand and all, there was skin grafts that had to be taken care of. And my left leg and my buttocks required extensive grafts. People that don't know anything about grafting, it's quite excruciating. They would take you to the operating room, and they had this little device where they would just shave off the top layer of skin. They just start down my right leg to harvest some skin, some viable tissue, and then they would move it over to my leg, and they would staple it on these burns or massive burns on my legs and on my buttock, and they would staple those harvested pieces of skin on there. So here I had a hand that had been amputated and grafts on it that had to be taken care of, and now I've got injuries on my left leg and across my buttock. So it was a mess for days. When all these grafts finally took, they would have staple pulling parties. They would come in and start removing the staples because they'd have to get them out of there or they would lose them. So it was a mess. They'd start pulling these staples out. I'd start crying. It was so painful. And the nurses would cry, and they would finally call the doctor and tell him he's going to have to come in and put me to sleep and pull the staples. So that went on for some time. In the meantime, my daughter was supposed to get married. And so here I was in the burn unit. We had planned for a nice, big, elaborate, wedding and church wedding, and had about 400 people that were coming for the ceremony. And so they had to get busy and send out sorry you can't come cards to most everybody that they had sent them to because of what had happened. And so the day of the wedding finally came, which was June the 29th of 1996. Two of the off-duty burn unit nurses came in on their day off and wheeled me up to the eye center at the Erlanger Hospital. The power board commandeered the eye center. There was on the weekend and all, it was vacant. There were no office people in there. So troubleshooters came and cordoned off the eye center, put barrier tapes up, wouldn't let anybody come in except those that were there for the wedding. And my daughter, there was a elevator there. There's a glass elevator that rises up and goes up from the floor where we were at. And so my daughter came down that glass elevator with her wedding dress on and came over to where I was in my air mattress bed where my attendants were there with me, but I didn't have to wear that tux that they had thought that I was going to wear. I got to wear a emerald colored robe. So I was laying in my air bed with my daughter beside me, and so I got to see her married and got to see her leave. So it was really an experience as far as that goes, and also as far as my recuperation. And when I got to leave the burn center, I went over to Siskins for rehab over there. So that continued for several weeks, and then they finally dismissed me from there, and I would come back for outpatient rehab weekly. Started out 2 times a week, and then dropped back to one day a week there for some time. November the 1st, I got to come back to the power board. I got to walk back into the power board. Believe it or not, they first said that I was going to lose my left leg, and I would probably not make it through the night because they felt like I was going to be burned up internally when I first arrived at the hospital. They didn't know what it had done to my internal organs, but it all came down to the fact that I had made it. In November of 96, I walked back into the power board. I was no longer able to climb poles. The job that I had advanced to as a troubleshooter, which I dearly loved because there was always something different going on, I would no longer get to do that. But they let me come back as a line inspector, which was a job that linemen know well and all, and it's usually reserved for somebody like me that's had some kind of an accident or something like that. They let you go out and inspect lines. So I did that for a while.
Do you remember any jobs that you were on the morning before?
To be honest with you, no, I really don't. I mean, just a day like every other day. I'm sure